If it's Thursday, massive legislation and a massive win for the White House. The president's sprawling mega bill is now headed to his desk to be signed into law after a grueling fight to get it through the House and over the finish line. Plus, Democrats vow to fight on all the way to the midterms after House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries delivers a record-breaking floor speech opposing the legislation. And detainees begin arriving at the facility dubbed Alligator Alcatraz after I got an in-depth look inside the new migrant detention center and pressed the acting ICE Director about humanitarian concerns surrounding its very existence. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Gabe Gutierrez in Washington, where it's been yet another historic day that will shape the future of American politics. The House of Representatives passing President Trump's signature domestic policy legislation. It includes trillions of dollars in tax cut extensions, hundreds of billions in new funding for the president's immigration crackdown, and dramatic cuts to entitlement programs like Medicaid. The sprawling bill passed after a grueling 48 hours of arm twisting, closed-door negotiations, and marathon rounds of voting on the House floor. It all led to this.
The motion is adopted.
The moment Speaker Johnson gavelled in the final vote by an incredibly slim margin, 218 to 214. Largely on party lines, with Republicans Thomas Massie of Kentucky and Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania voting with all the Democrats against the legislation. After the vote, Speaker Johnson signed it and gave credit to his conference for getting the bill passed.
The beauty of unified government is this is exactly how it can work and how it's supposed to work, is that you have an interaction between the executive and the legislative branches, because that's what's best for the people. And that coordination is going to yield great results. They're going to feel this pretty quickly. Wages will rise. I think household income will go up. I think the job participation rate will increase dramatically. I think unemployment will be low.
The bill now heads to the president's desk, where he's expected to hold a signing ceremony tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The White House also says the president will speak at length about the bill at his event in Iowa tonight. In a statement, the White House celebrated the bill, saying the pro-growth policies will lead to, quote, an economic boom like never seen before. Getting his major piece of legislation over the finish line was tumultuous at best and did not come without some major hurdles and delay tactics. Starting yesterday, when the House held open a procedural vote for more than 7 hours, making it the longest vote in modern congressional history. And Speaker Johnson continued to work behind the scenes to corral his conference and assuage concerns that the bill's steep cuts to Medicaid could backfire on them politically. And then today, we saw Democrats' final stand against the president's mega bill, with Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries delivering a record-breaking 8-hour and 44-minute speech on the House floor, railing against the bill.
And that's exactly what Every single Democrat stands in strong opposition to this bill because we're standing up for the American people. This reckless Republican budget is an immoral document. We're going to continue as House Democrats to take our sweet time on behalf of the American people. Because the issues are too significant, we're going to press on until victory is won. I yield back.
Jeffries clearly looking to fire up Democrats about their prospects in next year's midterms, even going so far as to nickname that effort Project 2026. And joining me now is our team of reporters, NBC News senior national political reporter Sahil Kapoor, NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba, and NBC News senior business correspondent Christine Romans. Thank you all so much for joining me. Sahil, I want to start with you, though. What's the mood like on Capitol Hill right now that the Republicans were able to get the president's bill across the finish line? And what does it say about the politics of this moment and the power the president continues to wield over the party?
Well, Gabe, Republican leaders are certainly very elated right now. They have good reason to be. Usually it takes multiple laws to pass provisions of this magnitude, but they made a pretty daring bet that they could stack the president's entire domestic agenda, really everything they could fit through this budget reconciliation process in one massive package, $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, more than $1 trillion in spending cuts, and that just about every Republican in these narrow majorities would ultimately vote for it. And to that end, they were right, despite all the complaining, despite all the criticisms and the objecting that we heard from Republicans across the spectrum throughout, from politically vulnerable members to some of the most conservative hardline members, nearly every one of them folded in the end and said they are not going to say no to President Trump's agenda. And that was the ace in the hole that Republican leaders had all along. That absolutely speaks to the level of power that President Trump has accumulated. The Republican Party of a decade ago had various different power centers, that would have the backs of members to make serious demands, to push for their own priorities and withhold votes unless they were met. Those factions are all gone now. They've all collapsed into one Donald Trump. He's the only game in town. Just two Republicans at the end of the day were willing to say no to him. One of them is Tom Massey of Kentucky. He has opposed Trump in the past and survived re-election. He told me he has Trump antibodies for that. And the second one is Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick. This one was a little bit of a surprise. He represents one of the very few districts that President Trump lost in 2024 and is still represented by a Republican. He said the Medicaid cuts go too far for him. Gabe.
And Monica, speaking of the president's power, what do we know about his role in flipping those key votes?
It seems like it was key, Gabe. He was really engaged yesterday for almost the entire day, either in meetings, in person with some of these holdouts who came to the White House to express their final concerns, and on the phone. He was even speaking with key members, key lawmakers, and with the House Speaker around 1 a.m. this morning, trying to really get all of this finalized and get it to where it was able to pass this afternoon. Now, the president had even said he was okay with the deadline sliding a little bit. This was a self-imposed July 4th deadline that he had put out there. But then ultimately, the fact that it did pass today and that he's going to be able to sign it tomorrow with a lot of fanfare, I might add, at the White House. He's going to essentially attach this bill signing to a previously planned military family picnic that is taking place on the South Lawn to mark the holiday. And then he's going to cap the evening off with the traditional White House 4th of July celebration where they gather to watch fireworks. And the fact that there are even going to be some flyovers to additionally celebrate the military is really going to cap a day, I think, for this president that he's going to call historic, that he's going to tout as a major, major victory. Now, that's how we got to this point. And that, again, the president will be somebody who I think takes a lot of credit for his work as it got very close to the 1 yard line. But now this larger question is raised about how he will answer for some of the provisions in the bill that are not as popular. And the White House is already trying to dismiss those today, saying that this is going to create a lot of growth in the economy. They're going to try to put it and market it that way. But then, of course, there are these answers for candidate Trump, who claimed he would not make cuts to Medicaid. Now, with the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office saying as many as 11 million people will be stripped of their health care as a result of this law. Gabe.
Monica, you mentioned what we expect from the president tomorrow. Have we heard from the president so far himself yet this afternoon? I know he's heading to Iowa later on tonight, right?
Yeah, and the White House says that much of his speech tonight is going to be dedicated to this major legislative victory. He spent an earlier part of the afternoon meeting with freed hostage Idan Alexander, who was in Hamas captivity for more than 580 days. The White House put out a video of that earlier today. So he's been attending to some other matters, the White House says, and again, he's trying to perhaps get an Israel and Hamas ceasefire over the finish line for next week. We know the Israeli prime minister is set to come to meet with President Trump, so he's trying to juggle a couple of those different things. And then tonight is supposed to be the speech. But as he leaves the White House, as he so often does, Gabe, when he gets to Air Force One, it's possible he could talk with reporters there, because you better believe he's going to want to spike the ball, so to speak, on this big victory. And
like usual, busy times on the White House speak. Monica. Saha, I want to turn back to you. Minority Leader Jeffries delayed the vote for almost 9 hours, as we said. What is next for Democrats here? What's the messaging strategy going forward?
Well, Democrats certainly didn't have the votes to torpedo this bill, despite their best efforts, and that's because Republicans used a process where they can pass it on their own, using their majorities and bypassing a filibuster in the Senate. But what Democrats can do is, A, try to win the battle of public opinion. So far, polls indicate they are winning the battle of public opinion. This bill is not popular. A recent Fox News poll found that this bill is about 20 points underwater with the country at large. That is the point that Democrats are going to try to press forward. They're going to try to capitalize on that and make these Republicans pay a political price in the next midterm election. And to that end, take a listen to what Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, who's trying to become Speaker of the House next time, said in his record-breaking speech.
Well, I know that there are people concerned with what's happening in America, but understand what our journey teaches us is that after Project 2025 comes Project 2026. And you will have an opportunity to end this national nightmare.
Now, the argument you will hear over and over and over again from Democrats is that Republicans are cutting taxes for the wealthiest Americans and for billionaires, paying for it by cutting health care, Medicaid, and food stamps for the working class. It's very reminiscent of the message that Democrats used in 2018 ahead of that blue wave, when Republicans then tried to repeal the ACA unsuccessfully, but passed the original Trump tax cut, which has now just been extended.
So, Saho, you mentioned this tax cut extension. Also, everybody's been talking about the changes to Medicaid. When will people actually start to feel the impact of what's in this bill?
Yeah, let's look at a timeline on this. The Trump tax cuts were set to expire at the end of this year. They will not expire. They have now been extended. So starting 2025, next year, those Trump tax cuts will largely continue in existing form, but with some changes. No tax on tips and overtime. There's a temporary provision for 4 years that include those two. It's not really clear exactly how many people would benefit from no tax on tips, for instance, because there's a deduction there. The vast majority of those workers, or at least a very, very significant number of them, don't pay enough in taxes to really benefit from that deduction. The food stamp work requirement starts as early as 2025, and the Medicaid work requirements, one of the most significant pieces of this, starts on the last day of 2026 at the latest, although there seems to be some flexibility that allows states to trigger them earlier. So the savings are going to come a little bit later. Republicans backloaded the savings and some of the most aggressive cuts until after the midterm elections.
And thanks for that timeline. Saho, what are some of the other winners and losers of this bill?
Yeah, we can consider several of them, Gabe. For the winners, the biggest winners are high-earning taxpayers. There will be some, tipped workers and those who make overtime who will pay less in taxes as a result of this. The fossil fuel industry is a real winner because the government just took away a bunch of incentives for clean energy. Stephen Miller and the architects of the mass deportation agenda, huge winners. They now get more than $100 billion to carry out that agenda. The military gets a boost of $100 billion as well, more than that. And as far as the losers go, it's going to be Medicaid and SNAP recipients. Millions of them are going to lose their coverage or have to fill out these new paperwork requirements, proving their eligibility, proving they're working at least 80 hours a month. Republicans have argued that these are just able-bodied adults who should be required to work, not people with disabilities or people who have young kids. So they're going to press that point again and again. The question is how many people are going to fall through the cracks as a result of this red tape. Hospitals and providers, some of them are all going to take a hit. There's one rural hospital in Nebraska that's already announced it's closing, cash strapped. Things are going to get worse as a result of this bill. And the clean energy industry, big loser in this bill. About $500 billion in incentives were taken away. Lastly, Gabe, deficit hawks, massive losers in this bill. Despite the messaging from Republicans, this bill increases the deficit by more than $3 trillion, according to the Congressional Budget Office.
And Monica, I want to go quickly back to you. We talked about the role that the president played here, but do we know exactly what he offered to get some of these GOP holdouts on board?
Well, senior White House officials don't want to get too specific on that because they really point out that obviously nothing changed between the Senate version and the House version that ultimately passed, because had there been any kind of amendment or even a change to a single word, it would have had to go back through that process. So they're trying to argue that really this was more of the president being willing to hear their concerns, to have a conversation, but that there weren't going to be any side deals as it relates to this particular legislation. But what we've heard from some House members who were part of these conversations is the idea that the president did promise on future conversations about future legislation or other kinds of ideas of legislation that could come up in the future that he would be willing to perhaps listen to their input or give them what they were looking for. But in the end, there isn't any kind of a real concession here that had to be made. The Republicans who had all of their issues raised ultimately in the end said, OK, I'm going to get in line and get behind the president. Gabe.
Monica, how about the White House? Sahil Kapoor on Capitol Hill. We thank you. Now I want to turn to Christine Romans, our senior business correspondent, who has been waiting so patiently. Christine, thank you for that. As Monica noted, well, first, I want you to kind of take a step back here and give us a bigger picture here. As Monica noted, the president has been posting about this. He's been touting this as a pro-growth piece of legislation. Give us a reality check. What will the economic impact of this legislation be?
I mean, the benefits go predominantly to high earners and companies. You know, you've got this 100% write-off that so many businesses were really happy about, and writing off research and development. And so the Treasury Secretary is saying just the clarity for business that this has been resolved, this tax limbo hanging over them has been resolved, and that will be explosive for the American economy. That's the position of the White House. Then you have the hospital industry and the healthcare industry, which, for example, in today's jobs report showed another month of strong jobs creation. Hospitals have been really important for the economy, especially over the past 20 years or so. They're gearing up for these big cuts that will affect them, and their perspective is this: you know, Medicaid isn't a check that goes into a poor person's pocket. It's money that goes to pay a lab tech, a janitor, a doctor, a nurse, a hospital. And so they're really concerned about what that's going to mean overall for the economy.
And Christine, first of all, the markets did very well today. At least that's what the White House has been saying. We also, as you said, we got that latest jobs report. The U.S. adding 147,000 jobs in the month of June, unemployment falling to 4.1%. You touched on this a little bit, but what should we make of those numbers?
You know, it's still a resilient job market, and it's been remarkable. This has been a job market you haven't been able to count down in the past 3 or 4 years. But you look under the hood, and you can see half of that job creation was from state and local governments. You had federal jobs lost. We're just the tip of the spear of probably those DOGE cuts starting to affect that. And so that's not sustainable when so much of the job creation is not the private sector, but the state and local government. So we're going to watch that really, really closely here. And again, you've got more deadlines, trade deadlines looming, with still waiting for some clarity. But stocks seem to think the president is not going to put big tariffs on again. So we'll see. Maybe they're wrong. Yeah,
certainly a lot to watch. And now that you mention it, why not talk more about that? The president's July 9th tariff deadline is also nearing. That's next week. Hard to believe. But what could that mean for businesses and consumers? I know he announced a trade deal with Vietnam, but are we expecting more?
Well, we need more details, too. As you know, I mean, the president puts in social media posts progress, but we haven't seen this stuff papered up yet, right? So that's what we're really kind of waiting for. And the Treasury Secretary keeps saying that, look, if you're not negotiating in good faith, you could have a big tariff put on you on July 9th. But clearly, business and markets don't want that. The question is, how much progress are they really making, and will these tariff rates change? You know, Gabe, if you're a business owner and you're getting ready for the big holiday shopping season, you still don't know for sure what your tariff rates are going to be, what the costs are going to be at the borders and the ports come October 1st. And so the worry is that uncertainty has a chilling effect on hiring in the weeks and months ahead.
Our senior business correspondent, Christine Romans, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And coming up, Democrats prepare for the political battle ahead as the president's mega bill is about to become law. I'm joined by a top House Democrat to unpack the Democratic response and strategy here. Plus, an agenda unleashed, what the bill's passing and other recent victories for the White House say about the president's power, influence, and what comes next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Stay with us. And welcome back. As we've been discussing, it's been quite a day on Capitol Hill. Let's turn now to one of the members who cast a vote. Joining me now is California Democratic Congressman Robert Garcia. He is the newly minted ranking member on the House Oversight Committee. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. Look, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries directly tied today's vote to next year's midterm elections, using the term Project 2026. Do you see things the same way?
I think the leader is absolutely right. I mean, first, this bill is horrific for the American public, and certainly it is crazy that you would have Republicans in competitive districts voting to rip away health care, rip away food assistance so that they can give huge tax breaks to billionaires. And so I think that Republicans knew it was on the table. They're going to harm the American public And there will be consequences for that. I think one way that we can stop this Trump agenda is certainly to win back the majority in 2026.
Congressman, you brought up health care. President Trump is saying that the Medicaid changes aren't really cuts and that this bill will merely preserve Medicaid for folks who really need it. You know, he has a pretty big megaphone, obviously, as president. Are you concerned that it's just going to be louder than yours?
Well, the president always has the loudest megaphone. We know that already. But we're going to be out there campaigning across the country. We're going to be going to town halls. I'm going to spend a lot of my break going to Republican districts, as I've been doing, and communicating how harmful this bill actually is. And it's not just us saying it. It's the independent analysts. It's the Congressional Budget Office. It's governors, including governors in red states, that are actually saying don't actually harm Medicaid. And so we know that healthcare is going to be impacted not just by the loss of Medicaid, but also the impacts to Obamacare. And then it goes beyond that. It's not just that. It's also the food assistance. You're going to actually have school districts across the country having to make decisions because of cuts in funding about the type of food assistance they give to their kids.
And look, last November, the economy and cost of living overshadowed pretty much every other campaign issue. Why are you so sure that Medicaid cuts will move the needle more than tax cuts?
We know that people in this country rely on their health care and that Medicaid is a lifesaver for so many families. And if you yourself aren't on Medicaid, then you have a family member or you have a parent or a grandparent. And so it touches every family across this country. So it's critically important. But it's not just about Medicaid. It's why is that actual cut happening? It's because there's this transfer of wealth from the middle class and working class families that's about to go to the richest people in this country, to billionaires and millionaires who are receiving permanent tax cuts in this bill. And so it's important that the American public know why the cuts are happening and who's actually benefiting.
Congressman, I want to play what Speaker Johnson said on the floor earlier today about the social safety net.
Pregnant women, children, seniors, single mothers, the disabled, and the low-income Americans among us receiving Medicaid and SNAP will have the peace of mind of knowing that we've made these safety nets stronger with our reforms. We're going to make sure that Americans who do need and deserve those critical programs won't have to compete against people who can work but choose not to do so. That's not right.
Congressman, what's your reaction to that?
I mean, those were just lies. I mean, if you talk to anyone that's been in the halls of Congress trying to lobby and meet with Republican lawmakers, people with disabilities, folks in wheelchairs, sick seniors, people that are dependent on their health care, like veterans across this country, they would tell you that they are going to be impacted and that their dependence on programs like SNAP, for example, and food assistance is critical to them surviving. Let's be clear, this bill removes millions of dollars from food assistance, millions for states, for each individual states. Each state's going to lose tens of millions of dollars. And when you think about the entire impact across the country, and you look at the actual raw numbers, the estimates, and this is, by the way, Congressional Office, this is independent analysis, it's somewhere between 16 and 17 million people that could lose these benefits and health care. And so it's really serious. And I think it's really unfortunate the Speaker is making up his own facts and figures to a lot of the American public.
And I want to switch now to the topic of immigration. Republicans, a lot of them have been presenting what's in this bill as a national security issue. And according to a recent NBC News poll, about 51% of Americans do approve of President Trump's handling of the border and immigration. That's a NBC News Decision Desk poll. Is that something that you and Democrats really want to be against?
Well, look, I've seen obviously some polls where the president's also underwater on immigration issues. But at the end of the day, what this bill also does is it supercharges ICE. It doubles essentially the funding. And look, if you take the budgets of like the FBI, for example, another agencies, just take the intelligence agencies, and you combine them all together, that budget is actually now going to be less than the new budget for ICE is going to be. So the idea that ICE is going to have more resources than the FBI is crazy. And why? So we can deport and arrest people without criminal records, so we can deport United States citizens, so we can ensure that people don't have due process in this country so that Donald Trump can implement his immigration agenda. I think it's really shameful that we're in this direction. And in a moment where we know that about 60% of folks that are being apprehended have not been convicted of anything, actually, I think give ICE more money is just be more terror in our communities.
So your colleague Susan Delbene told us that she believes that the more people learn about this bill, the more they oppose it. Is that a major obstacle for you? A recent Fox News poll said that fewer than 1 in 5 registered voters say that they have a good understanding of what's in this bill. So are you just having a tough time getting people to tune in at this point?
Look, there's obviously a lot of competing information for folks out there, and we know that people are receiving their information in a lot of different ways. That's why we are going to spend the next few weeks and months ahead of us talking about how horrific this action was by the Republicans and Donald Trump. And we're going to spend a large part of our congressional recess, I certainly will be, in Republican districts, talking to voters directly and asking folks like David Valadao in California in the Central Valley why he would vote to cut Medicaid when he has more Medicaid recipients in his district than any other district in the state of California. It's going to impact farm workers and day laborers and small business owners. Republicans have to be held accountable for their corruption and why they're supporting this bill.
Speaking of Republicans accountable, what about Democrats? And hear this. Kamala Harris ran on extending the 2017 Trump tax cuts for those making under $400,000 a year. Why didn't we see Democrats put up their own counter legislation to this Trump mega bill, at least as a messaging tool?
I mean, we would have been happy to have worked with Republicans on any part of this bill, but they had no interest. They slammed it through the Senate, they slammed it through the House, and they made it clear on day one that they weren't actually interested in actual tax cuts for middle-class families or low-income families. They were interested by making permanent tax cuts for billionaires and millionaires. That was their focus on day one. They had no interest in bipartisanship. And on top of that, they made ICE even more larger and with the ability to terrorize communities. They took away health care from, we know, 60 to 17 million people. They removed food assistance. And so they did not work with us. We could have actually worked together to make this bill better, and they chose not to do so.
And Congressman, you are the newly minted ranking member on the House Oversight Committee. If Democrats do take control of the House, what would your plans be?
Well, look, I think oversight is obviously at the heart of what Congress does. We're focused on accountability and transparency. There's two main things. I mean, one, we are going to hold Donald Trump, his corruption, and the corruption of those that are trying to harm the American public accountable. When you think about this foreign planes and this crypto scheme he's doing that's enriching himself and his family and his foreign investment deals, that's got to be investigated and there's got to be accountability. And then at the same time, we've got to rebuild our government and our agencies post-DOGE. That is not government efficiency. We can actually work to make government work better for the public. That's the mission of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, and we look forward to that work ahead.
Representative Robert Garcia of California. Congressman, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And turning now to another piece of breaking news out of the White House today. The president announcing on social media this morning that he would be speaking with Russian President Vladimir Putin at 10 a.m. But as of this moment, the White House has not provided what's known as a readout from that conversation. The Kremlin described the call as a frank and substantive discussion. According to the Kremlin, Putin told President Trump that Russia will not step back from its goals in Ukraine, but was still interested in negotiating an end to the war. It comes just days after the Pentagon announced it was pausing a weapons shipment to Ukraine, citing concerns over the U.S. military's stockpiles. It also comes as Russia is intensifying its offensive against Ukraine, conducting some of the largest attacks since the war began more than 3 years ago. And up next, President Trump is on something of a winning streak. My panel joins me to break down the political outlook and the potential warning signs for both parties. Ahead, you're watching Meet the Press Now. And welcome back. Today's House vote on the president's agenda bill caps a pretty good couple of weeks for President Trump, starting with those U.S. military strikes on Iran's nuclear program with minimal retaliation from Tehran. The president also getting a boost from a major Supreme Court victory, placing new restrictions on the judiciary branch's ability to check his power. And there have been some hopeful signs economically for the White House as well, including the framework of a trade deal with a key trading partner, Vietnam, in addition to a jobs report that showed continued resiliency in the U.S. labor market. For more on all that, I'm joined now by the panel. Francesca Chambers, White House correspondent for USA Today. Donna Edwards, former Democratic Congresswoman from Maryland and now an NBC News political analyst. And Lance Trover, Republican strategist who served as a spokesman for Doug Burgum's presidential campaign. Thank you all so much for joining me. Francesca, I want to start with you. So, is there any doubt that President Trump simply owns the Republican Party right now?
Well, and don't want to give it too much away, but we were talking about this during the break. We talked about how in the Senate, Tom Tillis was one of the only holdouts on this bill, and then he promptly announced that he wasn't running for re-election after President Trump said that he would try to find a primary challenger for him in North Carolina, you know, a very key state.
That was a surprise.
And it really tells you where the Republican Party is at this time. Of course, Rand Paul was also a no, and then we also had Susan Collins, who was also a no. Those were expected. Fewer than there could have been. The vice president, a real opportunity for him to show what he brought to the ticket, what he brought to the White House, and why many presidents choose to have former senators on the ticket with them.
So he clearly has all this power. Did you ever think that this bill was not going to pass? At least for me, I never really thought it wouldn't pass, given his track record with Republicans. I wasn't sure would happen before July 4th. How critical was that deadline, you think, for getting it passed?
I think the date was in question. You all along had Ron Johnson saying, well, I could get to a yes on this. And you heard some other lawmakers who just wanted the president and the House leadership to make a deal with them on certain things that they were concerned about, whether it was Medicaid or it was that SALT cap. But to your point about the deadline, we've all been in this town long enough to know that without some sort of a deadline, I'm sure Don will weigh in on this here in a second, that Congress can't get things done. And if they had pushed it all the way into the end of recess and just said, well, we want to get it done before August recess, then you could have ran into a situation where that would have just stretched out on and on.
Yeah, Lance, would they have just kept talking if there was no deadline here?
I mean, you have to give a deadline. I mean, again, I would defer to the former Congresswoman here about all that. Yeah, absolutely. I think we're looking at one of the most consequential 6-month time periods of any presidential term, certainly in my memory. And I think what also makes it more profound is it's the first 6 months of a second-term president and what he has managed to get done. This bill today is ginormous. The tax cut package, what we saw happen with Iran, we've seen the job market holding up, we've seen the border close, we've seen a number of executive orders, which the Supreme Court last week, basically said can go forward. This has been an incredible 6 months. I don't even think Democrats can deny it. I mean, what has been accomplished?
He has, and as we mentioned in the introduction, he has gotten a lot of wins in the last couple of weeks. But what about these Republicans that just a few days ago were arguing that this would blow up the deficit? There was going to be cuts to Medicaid. How do you just turn around on a dime and vote for this today?
Look, everybody's got concerns about the bill, and we saw there are a number of issues. I mean, the SALT issue being one of them. We had the lawmakers like Mike Lawler and Nick LaLota and others. There are always going to be issues that come arise, but you're going to have to come together to pass the bill. I'm with you. This thing was always going to pass because failure wasn't an option. The president had staked so much on it, it was always going to get through Congress.
Donna, how did Democrats play this?
Well, I think very smartly. I think if you listen to
smartly,
I do. I think if you listen to Hakeem Jeffries' remarks during the course of that 9 hours, you can see where Democrats are going in terms of laying down a marker for this bill. I think that they're going to pick, a couple of issues, 3 or 4 issues that they're going to hammer on between now and November 2026. And I think that they're all going to have to really stay on message and stay in line. I know this is something that gets complicated for my party, but I think it's going to be really important because otherwise they're not going to be able to communicate with the American people about what's in this bill and who gets hurt. Poor people, seniors, anybody who receives nutrition programs, they're all going to be hurt. Those are working class people who supported Donald Trump. He betrayed them in this legislation. I mean, taking money out of the mouths or food out of the mouths of children in order to satisfy billionaires and give them tax cuts, that's not going to go over well with the American people. And Democrats, though, are going to have to tell the story.
Lance, what's the point of the Freedom Caucus right now?
Again, I'm not going to pick and choose an attack. They've got their issues, and they have stepped out. There are people who are in the governing majority who have stepped out. But everybody got a little bit of what they want. Everybody got things that they didn't want. That's part of a negotiation. That's how Congress works. And look, they've got a big deal. I think Republicans have a lot to run on in this bill, and you saw it come out of the NRCT today. They're going to go on offense and talk about the tax cuts versus the tax increases that the Democrats wanted. No tax on overtime, no tax on tips. That's where I'm going to really disagree with you on working people. That is going to be huge in states like Nevada and other districts around the country. So if I'm them, I'm going home and I'm touting all this positive stuff that's coming.
Francesca, I want to put up some of our reporting. I'll let you follow up on that. But there's some reporting from our friends at Notice about a meeting the president had with moderate Republicans yesterday. It says that according to 3 sources with direct knowledge of the comments, the president told Republicans at this meeting that there are 3 things Congress should not touch if they want to win elections: Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. But we're touching Medicaid in this bill, one member responded to Trump, according to the 3 sources. Trump may be immune to political blowback, but what about the Republican House members who are on the ballot?
Well, and senators as well.
Right.
And those things that Notice reported that the president said, I mean, that is consistently what President Trump has said. He said publicly that he didn't think that Republicans should touch those things, including in the 2024 campaign. But the thing that lawmakers had been worried about, as you correctly point out here, had been the Medicaid cuts. And of course, some were also concerned about the deficit spending as well. Now, as it pertains to whether or not this was always a done deal, you know, I think back to the president's press conference on Friday when I asked him about the bill and asked him what he was doing to try and get Republicans on board. And he said at one point, I think we're doing fine. But he didn't sound super confident. And then he made an appeal at that point to try and be like, why won't Democrats vote for this? You know, where's Fetterman at on this? Which I thought was so interesting at the time, to try and put pressure on maybe some Democrats who he thought he could get. And that signaled to me that he wasn't necessarily confident that they would get this over the finish line.
Is he going to have to go out and sell this? I mean, we heard from my colleague Monica earlier that the speech he's planning to give at the rally tonight in Iowa will focus heavily on this. Obviously, he wants to take a victory lap. But what do you think you'll have to do in the coming months to be able to sell this to the American people?
Well, the deadline itself was part of what the White House felt they needed to do to sell this to the American people in time for the midterm elections. They looked back to what Joe Biden did and felt like they needed more time than Democrats had had, as well as the tax bill in his first administration that this helped to extend. They thought that there simply wasn't enough time. So time itself is a large part of the argument here.
All right, Donna, your old colleague Susan Delbini told us yesterday that she hopes the midterms will be a referendum on this package. Hakeem Jeffries today talking about Project 2026. How big of a deal do you think this will be in next year's midterms?
Well, I think it's going to factor really hugely. I mean, first of all, you're not going to be able to sell to the American people that 12 million people are losing their health care coverage, or sell to states that they're going to have to make up the difference. You're not going to be able to sell to the American people that children who need nutrition programs for breakfast and lunch aren't going to be able to get that because they've lost the money in this bill. And so, again, I think it's going to be really incumbent on Democrats to stick to message. Don't choose everything under the sun in this bill. There's a lot of bad stuff in it. Pick out that handful of things and then run on those.
Francesca, really quickly, as we're running low on time, we were talking about, yes, the president's on a winning streak. There is something significant he has not had a win on. Today he spoke with Vladimir Putin. We still don't know what's going on with the war in Ukraine. What do you make of that?
Well, last week when he was at the NATO summit, he also acknowledged that this has been more difficult than he once thought it would be able to solve this war. He also said that he'd had some issues with Zelensky in the past, but he was more focused on Vladimir Putin when he made that comment at the time. Then we saw him speak again to Putin today. We don't know from the U.S. side what they discussed during that call, as you noted before, the Russians saying that they reiterated their position.
And Lance, I'll give you the last word. Winning streak for the president. What would you like to see as his next win?
I mean, there's been so many in this. Look, I think what you are going to see out of them, given the Supreme Court decision last week, I think you're going to see more executive orders coming on issues like gender-affirming care and these universities and where they've been stepping out of line, at least according to the administration.
All right. Lance, Donna, Francesca, thank you all so much for joining me here on the panel. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And after the break, an inside look at the swampland migrant detention facility dubbed by its supporters as Alligator Alcatraz, and what the acting ICE director had to say about humanitarian concerns about the facility. When we come back, you're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Turning now to several developing stories surrounding the Trump administration's immigration crackdown. First, in a potential setback for the White House, a federal judge is blocking the administration's asylum ban at the U.S. southern border. The judge ruled late yesterday that the president exceeded his authority by issuing a proclamation declaring illegal immigration an emergency and blocking all migrants from claiming asylum or other protections. The judge says he would delay the effective date of his order 14 days to allow the Trump administration to appeal, which the White House says it will do. And that ruling came as migrants began arriving yesterday at the controversial new detention center known as Alligator Alcatraz. The facility on the site of an old airport in the Florida Everglades was built in just 8 days and is surrounded by swampland inhabited by alligators, snakes, and other wildlife. I toured the center with acting ICE Director Todd Lyons, who told me his agency does not intend on keeping detainees there for more than 2 weeks. Who is going to be on these beds? Is it going to be the worst of the worst? Is it going to be people in the state of Florida that you pick up, or all around across the country?
So right now we're focused on the state of Florida. Anyone that our 287G partners encounter, if someone is here and the criminality is really bad, we'll use this as a staging to go to one of our longer-term detention facilities. But again, we want to focus on those individuals that have the opportunity to self-deport. But each case that's housed here will be looked at individually.
Is the administration still going after the worst of the worst?
We are. And like I said, that's my commitment, is that we are still going after the worst of the worst. But like any law enforcement agency, if we do encounter someone on the outside, or through the course of another law enforcement investigation, we do come across people that are just here illegally, we will no longer turn a blind eye to that.
I also pressed him on humanitarian concerns about the conditions there.
What do you say to critics who argue that this is inhumane?
You know, what I would say is that ICE, overall, compared to all the other agencies that detain individuals, we have the highest detention standards out of any law enforcement agency. So we ensure that people are detained, humanely, that they have medical care, they have access to their to legal services while they're here, religious services. But what I would say is, things like this are necessary because there are so many individuals that have seen an immigration judge that have been ordered removed from the United States. And, like I said, we want to ensure that we remove people back in a safe and humane manner. And we'd much rather do it quickly for these, not only for the people detained, like I said, but just for cost savings for the American government.
And as ICE's acting director defends the conditions at this new facility in Florida, attorneys for Kilmar Abrego Garcia are describing both physical and psychological torture they say their clients suffered while being held at a notorious mega prison in El Salvador. In a court filing yesterday, attorneys say Abrego Garcia, quote, faced mistreatment, quote, including but not limited to severe beatings, severe sleep deprivation, inadequate nutrition, and psychological torture, and that he suffered a significant deterioration in his physical condition and lost approximately 31 pounds, adding that he was deported to El Salvador in March. Abrego Garcia was deported in March. The Supreme Court ruled in April that his removal was illegal and ordered the Trump administration to facilitate his return, which eventually happened last month. He now faces federal criminal charges. In yesterday's filing, his attorneys argue that the federal government's treatment of him was illegal and violated his Fifth Amendment right to due process. And still to come, HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s brand new vaccine advisory panel met for the first time last week, and they're signaling big changes are coming. What that could mean for Americans' health when we return. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a longtime peddler of misinformation surrounding vaccine safety, has been moving to reshape U.S. vaccine policy, raising alarm within much of the medical community. According to new reports, the FDA's top vaccine official moved last month to limit the use of 2 COVID vaccines that had been approved, overruling recommendations by agency medical experts who plan to approve the shots for everyone 12 and older. It all comes after the new members of the CDC's Vaccine Advisory Committee, who were handpicked by Secretary Kennedy after he abruptly fired all 17 of its previous members, met for the first time last week. Among the agenda items was a presentation by a Kennedy ally on a debunked claim that a mercury-based preservative, which has been removed from nearly all U.S. vaccines, had links to autism. The committee also announced it would take a look at the childhood vaccine schedule and scrutinize vaccines that have been approved for decades. Well, joining me now is Dr. Paul Offit, director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and a former member of the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us here on Meet the Press Now. You've served on an advisory panel, so how unusual is it for a CDC or an FDA official to overrule the advice of the committee? And how concerned are you that medical professionals are getting left out of the policymaking process of all this?
Well, I think anti-vaccine activists have for decades been shouting from the sidelines. Now they're making policy. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. eliminated the 17 people on the ACIP Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices that had the kind of expertise and experience that we needed to get good decision-making. Now he's replaced them with people who are like him, science denialists and anti-vaccine activists, and to some extent conspiracy theorists. So now you're going to see an erosion of vaccine use in this country as he gets what he wants, RFK Jr., which is to make vaccines less available, less affordable, and more feared. It's a dangerous time.
And Doctor, I want to turn to the childhood vaccine schedule that we mentioned. What do parents need to know if the CDC decides to make changes?
Well, the good news is there are sort of these parallel advisory committees, like the American Academy of Pediatrics, National Foundation of Infectious Diseases, have now formed together and are working with insurance companies to make sure that if the current ACIP, which is really an anti-vaccine committee on immunization practices, makes bad recommendations, that at least you can turn to them and that insurance companies will cover vaccines that they recommend, even if the ACIP doesn't. So I think that's good. What worries me is that the CDC is also being eroded. And there are people who have quit the CDC because they feel that their data are being misrepresented or suppressed.
Where can parents go if they're looking for other resources about vaccine safety and what vaccines their children should be getting?
Well, I think they still trust your doctor and healthcare professional. I think that they will be able to get the kind of information that they need to make good decisions, because for the most part right now, the medical and scientific community are ignoring the ACIP, as they should, because they have made a terrible decision last time on this influenza vaccine containing thimerosal. That was an anti-science decision. And the person who did the presentation was an anti-vaccine activist who gave that presentation without ever having her presentation reviewed by subject matter experts.
And are you surprised by how quickly, how sweeping these changes have been to U.S. vaccine policy, and what guardrails are in place to prevent the whole system from unraveling?
Yes, I think Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has gotten what he wanted. He's an anti-vaccine activist who's now taken over the system. And what worries me is what happened recently with the Global Alliance Vaccine Initiative. So this is a global alliance where the United States participates, and roughly 1 billion children have been vaccinated through this program, worldwide. It's probably saved 20 million lives. And he just withdrew from that program, which tells you he's perfectly willing to let children not be vaccinated in this world. And I think he's perfectly willing for children not to be vaccinated in this country.
How easily could a future HHS secretary or another administration reinstate some of the policies that Secretary Kennedy has rolled back?
I think that can happen. I do. I think that if things get bad enough and we do what we need to do, which is to ask Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to step down from this position, I do think we can put in place an advisory committee for immunization practices and reinstate a lot of what's been lost at the CDC to get this back again. I do.
And Doctor, there are still vacancies at the CDC's Vaccine Advisory Panel. What will you be watching for as those positions get filled?
Well, you'd like to think that they would bring on people who actually go with the good science instead of this sort of anti-vaccine activism that's going on. I'd like to think that's true. But, what really has to happen is there are 6 members of that committee who would never pass a confirmation hearing. They shouldn't be there.
And Doctor, just big picture for us, how concerned are you that future vaccine advisory committees will lose credibility?
Well, it's sad that it's become partisan to the extent that it has. I mean, public policy is always, to some extent, political because it depends on resources, but it doesn't have to be partisan. I think that we will regain our senses and put things back in place fairly quickly. I do believe that, but for right now, it's going to be a rough time.
Dr. Offit, we thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back Monday with more Meet the Press Now. And if it's Sunday, It's a special edition of Meet the Press, featuring Kristen's Meet the Moment interviews with actress Olivia Munn, legendary broadcaster Bob Costas, Khan Academy founder Saul Khan, and poet Amanda Gorman. Don't miss it. NBC News Now coverage continues with Tom Costello in for Hallie Jackson right now.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.